Now, BioShock is one of those games that we all look back on fondly because it was such a great game to experience for the first time. I personally played the entire series back in 2018 during my senior year of high school because I broke my ankle while riding a skateboard and I had to get surgery, so I spent 4 weeks of my recovery at home, and when you can't really move around with a broken ankle, the best thing you could do is sit and play through an entire video game collection. Now, today I want to talk about BioShock, because there have been a lot of leaks and rumors surrounding the next game, and I guess 2K Games has started working on either a remake or a sequel to the franchise, so now would be the best time to talk about the franchise's beginning and how we got to this point. Because if there is a remake or a sequel coming up, it would just be a great time to talk about it. But before we do that, I just want to quickly mention that my channel now has memberships for the price of $2.99 a month, which is the price of a cup of coffee. And when you sign up, you get access to a bunch of cool perks, like getting a shout out at the bottom of my videos. I plan on doing more once I get more members to sign up, but the first 8 people to sign up will get the opportunity to play games with me and get their channel shout out at the bottom of my videos. But let's get back to the video, and let's talk about the history behind BioShock. So the story for this game starts back in 2002 as the lead developer Ken Levine, who was a part of a former studio from 1997 called Looking Glass Studios. Ken Levine would create the studio Irrational Games with a combination of former members from Looking Glass. Looking Glass was responsible for creating System Shock back in the 90s, and these guys were actually from my hometown of Boston. And they would work on System Shock 2 as Irrational Games, and they would pitch the idea to Electronic Arts, but would be denied because of the poor sales from previous games. After this, they would work on other games that I'm not really too familiar with, and these were called Freedom Force, Tribe's Vengeance, and a cancelled title called Deep Cover, and a completed title but never released called The Lost, and this never released because of legal issues. At this point, Levine wanted to go back to a game like System Shock 2, which would be more of a free-form game with a strong narrative. So, in 2002, the team had come up with this idea for a gameplay mechanic that followed 3 main ideas: a drone that would carry resources, a protector that would guard the drones, and harvesters that would attempt to take the resources from the drones. This idea would later turn into what we know as the Big Daddies, Little Sisters, and Splicers in the final game. But at the time, there was no set theme for the game. The developers would start working on a setting so that they could pitch the idea to different publishers, and they would come up with a demo that would use Unreal Engine 2 from the original Xbox, and this demo took place aboard a spaceship that was overtaken by genetically mutated monsters. The main character would be Carlos Coelho, a cult deprogrammer who was in charge of rescuing people from different cults, and psychologically and mentally readjusting them back to normal life. Ken Levine described the story as, there are people who hire people to deprogram their daughter who has been in a lesbian relationship. They kidnap her and reprogram her, and it was a really dark person, and it was the kind of character that you were. This story would have been more political in nature, as the main character would be hired by a senator. The team would decide to eventually not make the game, and I can kind of see why. I mean, it's a little controversial, but they would scrap the whole thing and start over, reusing some of the key elements for the game that we know for BioShock. Many publishers also told them that they were not looking for immersive sims, as they did not sell very well. They would almost give up entirely until they saw the amount of hype that people had for this new game that the former System Shock developers were working on. So, after seeing all the hype, the project would revamp. By 2004, Take-Two Interactive, which is a partner company from 2K Games, offered to publish the game mainly because they liked the Harvester drone idea that the team had and wanted to see where it would go. The team would be given a lot of freedom with the story, and they pretty much got to do whatever they wanted with the game, which is something we really don't get to see a lot of in the gaming industry. By this time, the setting of the game had changed drastically from an old bunker in World War II, which had been unearthed by 20th century scientists. 21st century scientists. Get my words mixed up. The gameplay elements from this story would go remotely unchanged in the final version of the game. These elements would include the use of plasmids and Eve, and the need to use stealth and other options to deal with automatic sentry systems. Direction through the environment from a non-player character relayed over a radio, and some story elements delivered through audio recordings and ghosts of deceased characters. According to Levine, the team was provided a modest budget to work on the game. The company would be acquired in 2006 by 2K Games, so they would be the ones funding the entire project. Obviously, because, they're the parenting company of Take-Two Interactive. The team would release some gameplay which was similar to what would be released for the final product of the game, but after the design was shown off, the studio would then decide to change both the design for the game and the story, and this obviously would affect the overall final product. These changes would lead to many issues amongst the developers because there was a lack of communication and idea of where the direction of the game was going to go. A lot of that had to do with being bought by 2K because the game would expand from 6 people working on it to almost 60 people. They also thought the environment was very bland and needed more detail, so there was a lot of difficulties for the artists to come up with a design that would satisfy both the vision and the goals that was made by the lead developers. One of the lead designers would do a very critical experiment, and that would set up the design of basically the whole game. And that was having 2 of the level designers go off on their own to create their own unique vision of what they felt the game should look like. And this would eventually lead to the creation of the level Tea Garden. This would be what would create the underwater world of Rapture City. Levine stated that they had overdone the cyberpunk level design and the change was desperately needed, and that the futuristic cyberpunk design was what made EA refuse to do System Shock 3. So, right there, Rapture City was born. One of the main influences for BioShock was actually Capcom with their Resident Evil series, especially Resident Evil 4, because it was the newest one to release during that time. And like I said in my Resident Evil video, Resident Evil basically inspired a whole new generation of games. So the main idea for BioShock was a futuristic underwater design very similar to Rockefeller Center. The statue of Atlas in front of the building would inspire the creation of the character Atlas in the main game, along with all the different statues that you can see throughout the game. The history of Rapture and its leader Andrew Ryan would be loosely based on the story of Rockefeller himself. And the characters in the game, or the theme that they were trying to go at here, was that all these people who lived in the city were oppressed. Coming to the city freed them of that oppression, but in return they ended up becoming the oppressors they were trying to escape from, which Ken Levine felt was the perfect example of human history. At this point in development, the backdrop for Rapture City would be done, and they had yet to come up with the idea for the Harvester drone idea. They would eventually come up with the idea for the Big Daddy and Little Sister, along with the character either being the Harvester or the Savior of the Little Sisters. The original idea was to have them either be bugs or dogs in wheelchairs, but using little girls would fit the theme for the game perfectly. This idea actually shocked the developers at first, because the potential to kill the little girls to make the game more horrific would be an idea they could use. They could create an idea that would be similar to the game Night Trap, which is a creepy slumber party stalking game. Yeah, I wouldn't have wanted that for BioShock, but instead they would look to different books made by different philosophers like Ayn Rand. His book, Atlas Shrugged, which outlines the idea that a man should be driven by selflessness and not altruism. They would use this to create the philosophy behind Rapture City and Andrew Ryan's work. This would be extended to the Little Sisters, particularly whether or not the player should save the little girls or harvest their atom for the player's own benefit. 2K Games actually expressed concern with this idea, where the player would actively prey upon Little Sisters. and then would be alerted to the big daddies would be alerted to them, which would cause a big fight. 2K Games refused to ship a game that would punish players for doing the right thing. And if honestly that's the idea they got out of it, that's a little concerning. But my first idea would be like, well, we don't want the players to prey on little girls, but apparently to them they just didn't want players to be punished for making the right choice. And this would actually end up becoming a part of the game's appeal to the broader game market, because this idea would change to having to defeat the big daddies first in order to be able to make that choice. And it would just build an entire idea of the game being built on different choices that you make. But this would be met with criticism from media outlets for obvious reasons. Now, the game was supposed to only have one ending, where it would leave the character's fate up for debate, but they were forced to put in multiple endings based on the choice you made with the little sisters. Thus, the two endings for the game were created. Tensions between the team and the publishers would grow as the game got closer to release, because 2K Games would bring in new hires that Levine was distrustful of because they were egotistical, and he argued with them consistently in order to enforce his vision for the game. 2K would also get concerned with the growing budget for the game and told the team to turn the game strictly into a first-person game instead of a role-playing game hybrid they were going for. The closer they got to the release date, the more stress the team would get, and this would only set up round-the-clock work on the game, which exhausted the developers. Paul Hellquist, one of the team's developers, was actually excluded from many of the staff meetings because he would butt heads with Ken Levine, the creator of the game, and he would use his frustration with Levine and use it for designing the medical pavilion, which was a level he was in charge of at the time. 2K would end up granting an extension of the game to give the team more time to polish the game. This unfortunately left some hard-to-discover bugs and issues in the game undiscovered. One such case was an apparent Easter egg found in the remastered version in 2018, where, under certain conditions, the player can end up looking up at an object and it had the description, "Paul Hellquist did not do his job." Both Levine and Chris Klein, the game's lead programmers, confirmed the message was a cheeky jab at Hellquist left as a debugging message. Klein and Hellquist were developing the systems to show the descriptions of the objects to players when looked at, and Hellquist offered to complete all necessary descriptions in-game. To jokingly help prod Hellquist along, Klein put "Paul Hellquist did not do his job" as the default message within a executable code. While the code message was changed for the original release, the remastered version likely used a pre-final version of the BioShock code. Paul would see this revelation in good humor, and he would put out a tweet saying, "I should have added something in that said, if you are enjoying this, Paul Hellquist did his job." By January of 2007, the team would do a playtest where the responses were mostly negative. People complained of the setting being too dark, not knowing where to go, not liking the voice of Atlas, who at the time was voiced in a southern accent and was compared to a lecherous Colonel Sanders. This would lead the brightness changes, a quest marker, and a voice being switched to an Irish dude. After a late playtest, 90% of the people complained about the main character, as people did not feel a connection to him, as the lack of cutscenes were an issue. To remedy this, they would add a cheap intro cutscene where a plane crashed in order to set up the time period and add in the "would you kindly" phrase, alluding to something that would be explained later on in the game. The person overseeing the test stated that the game was likely to be a failure, but Levine pushed on and would finish the work on the game. The game would then launch in August of 2007 with a final budget of $25 million, and after the game launched, many people criticized the overly anti-Semitic themes within the different characters. And Levine did an interview claiming that this was not intentional, that he himself is culturally Jewish, and even though he does not follow Judaism. The characters were all written as Jewish because they were trying to find a place to escape oppression, and that's how they end up in Rapture City. I went back and replayed BioShock for this video, and I have a very mixed opinion on it, which I'll talk about later in the video, but for right now, let's move on into my brief explanation of the story of BioShock. So, at the start of the game, the protagonist Jack is a passenger on a plane which goes down in the Atlantic Ocean in 1960, sometime after ordered society in Rapture has collapsed. After surfacing, Jack finds himself to be the only survivor of the crash, and he swims to a nearby tower or a lighthouse that's on an island. He finds that there is a bathysphere which descends down into the ocean's abyss and leads him to the entrance of an underwater city called Rapture. An Irishman, Atlas, assists Jack in making his way to safety via the service radio found in a submarine vessel. Andrew Ryan, believing Jack is an agent of a surface nation, uses Rapture's automated systems and his pheromone-controlled splicers against him. Atlas tells Jack that the only way he can survive is to use the abilities granted by plasmids, and that he must kill the Little Sisters, accompanied by their hulking armored protectors, the Big Daddies, to extract their atom, inadvertently crossing paths with Jack. Dr. Tenenbaum urges him to save the Little Sisters instead, giving him a plasmid that will safely kill the embedded sea slugs in each of the sisters, reverting them back to normal girls. Atlas will then tell you that his wife and child have been hiding on a submarine and directs Jack towards it. Just as Jack and Atlas reach the bay where it's located, Ryan has it destroyed, enraging Atlas. Atlas will then guide Jack on a mission to kill Ryan, which throughout the game, I'm just kind of skimming over this a little bit, but you do get to go to different areas in the game where you fight different bosses. There's like a plastic surgeon that you fight, a musician or a performer that you fight. It's just a bunch of different bosses that you go up against. I'm just kind of briefly going over this, so, don't crucify me for not covering this in its entirety. I also wanted to try to leave out as much of the game as possible so that new people can go and play the game. But eventually, Jack will confront Ryan in his office after, he basically murdered Atlas's family, where the latter is casually playing golf. Ryan reveals a truth that he has pieced together. Jack was actually born in Rapture a mere 4 years ago, genetically modified to mature rapidly. He is Ryan's illegitimate son by an affair with Jasmine Jolin, who is an exotic dancer. Ryan further reveals that after purchasing Jack's embryo, Frank Fontaine designed him to obey orders that would precede or would be followed by a specific phrase called "Would you kindly?" Jack was sent to the surface during the Rapture Civil War started, and it put him beyond Ryan's reach. When the conflict between Fontaine and Ryan reached a stalemate, Jack was sent instructions to board a flight with a package and use its contents, which was a revolver, to hijack and crash the plane near the lighthouse, enabling him to return to Rapture as a tool of Fontaine. Because Jack was Ryan's son, he could freely use the Rapture bathysphere network, which was locked out to everyone except within Ryan's genetic ballpark. Finally, Ryan has Jack kill him, wanting to die on his own terms. With Ryan's death, Jack realizes too late that Atlas has been using a trigger phrase to control him. Atlas reveals himself to be Frank Fontaine, who faked his death to throw Ryan off his trail, and so he can take control of the city. Leaving Jack at the mercy of the reactivated security systems, Dr. Tenenbaum and her little sisters help Jack escape through the vent system, where he falls and loses consciousness. When Jack awakens, Dr. Tenenbaum had already deactivated some of the conditioned responses, such as the trigger phrase itself, and assists him into breaking the remaining ones. Among many of them, one of them can actually stop his heart. With the help of the Little Sisters, Jack is able to track down Fontaine, the mob boss, with having been cornered, injects himself with a vast amount of atom, and becomes an inhuman monster. Jack will battle him, eventually defeating him and allowing the Little Sisters to subdue and extract the atom from his body, killing him. There are 3 possible endings, depending on how the player interacts with the Little Sisters. All will be narrated by Dr. Tenenbaum. If the player rescues all of the Little Sisters, therefore saving their lives, the ending shows 5 Little Sisters returning to the surface with Jack and living full lives under his care. including their graduation from college, getting married, having children. It ends on a heartwarming tone with an elderly Jack surrounded on his deathbed by all 5 of the adult little sisters. If the player harvested and therefore killed all of the little sisters in the game ends with Jack turning on the little sisters after defeating Fontaine, presumably killing them all and taking their atom. Tenenbaum narrates what occurred, condemning Jack of his actions with voice thick with anger and contempt. Later, in the second ending, a ballistic missile submarine carrying a nuclear missile comes across the wreckage of the plane and suddenly is surrounded by bathyspheres containing splicers. The splicers kill all hands aboard the sub and they take control of it. If the player saved some of the little sisters but killed a few, while the ending is visually identical to the second one, though the tone of Tenenbaum's voice is a sad one as opposed to angry. So that's really the story to BioShock. I again briefly summarized it because I didn't want to go into too much detail because there is a lot of detail in terms of the levels and stuff, and it would just be like a walkthrough if I tried to talk about it all. But next, I want to talk about the fan reception, news about the remake and the sequel, should you play in 2024, and then my final thoughts. So, before BioShock would release, they would actually release a demo on the Xbox 360, and this demo would be released in August 2007, just a couple weeks before the full game would release. This would also lead to the full game being released August 21st, 2007, and would only release on the Xbox and PC at the time. There would later be a PS3 port, but this would be done by a completely different studio and would be released October 17th, 2008. This would feature a new mode called Survivor Mode, and it would make the enemies tougher. BioShock would also get bundled with Oblivion in December of 2008 because Bethesda and 2K Games worked on Oblivion and they were trying to sell more copies. They would eventually make an iOS port of the game, which would be a freaking disaster. Both the US and China would release this port, and the US, not surprisingly, would release a lazy episodic iOS port and basically only released one episode before getting delisted from the App Store. The second US port would be BioShock 3D, and this released in 2010, and let me tell you, 87% of this game was not 3D because of the low resolution of iPhones and Androids at the time. The game was a complete failure, and the Chinese iOS version was even worse, and that too would be delisted from the App Store. But when this game was released, it was praised, and it actually did not dip under a 9 from reviewers, which makes me wish we could go back to the early 2000s with games, because I feel like every game now does not get higher than a 7 or an 8. The only games I've seen get higher than an 8 recently was Baldur's Gate, Dead Space, and Alan Wake 2, but that's because those games were actually good and not stuffed with cheap microtransactions and cheap corner cutting. Everybody loved this game. I remember when this game released and everybody was talking about it. This game was rated the 4th highest game released in 2007, and people would praise it for its first action mechanics. Its story was extremely well done, and the main tactic of storytelling was done through audio diaries, which a lot of people loved. There was a lot that was praised, but people did note some things that were a huge issue, like the Vita Chamber recovery system. When the game released, you could die and the chamber would respawn the players at half health, and the enemies would get their health back. This would later be fixed in future updates and port releases, but this was something that many people were not happy about when the game released. The other issue was the gunplay itself. The developers actually noted this in multiple interviews that they wished the game had better gunplay, especially with the recoil on a lot of the weapons. A lot of people also felt that the graphics on the Xbox version were worse than the graphics on the PC version, so it made playing the Xbox version feel like a downgrade. People also felt that the choices in the game did not hold any real impact on the rest of the game, and that is something I kind of felt too, because they marketed this game as where your choices matter, but all it really does is give you an atom upgrade, and has no real impact besides for the ending. when people actually did the math, they figured out that you actually get 10% less Adam as opposed to killing them, and people felt that they should have adjusted that depending on the difficulty you play on. But those are just some of the main things that fans loved and hated about the game. BioShock sales were really good for 2007, where the game became the third best-selling game of August 2007, with 490,900 copies sold in the month of its release. In the weeks following the great reviews, the sales actually skyrocketed by 20%. As of June 2008, the sales were up to 2.2 million copies. By June 2009, that went up to 3.4 million copies. By June 2010, the game was up to 4 million copies. By 2024, the game has sold over 41 million copies. But that's really everything I could find about the release. Let's move into the sequel/remake news before we start to wrap up the video. While I have your attention here, I just want to say if you aren't subscribed, almost 97% of you who watch are not subscribed to the channel. I'm trying to get to 2,000 subs, and if you can help me, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you, and let's get back to the next section. So, as for information for BioShock 4, not much is really known right now. A lot of people are saying that we might get a remake before we get the sequel, but let me just go over what I have for information. As for BioShock 4, what we do know is that BioShock will be created by a new studio called Cloud Chamber, as the original studio that created BioShock was downsized and renamed to Ghost Story Games, and would only work on smaller titles for 2K. Ken Levine is actually working on the game Judas, which is like a BioShock copycat. So that's where he went. They posted an official announcement for BioShock 4 back in 2019 when the lead developer from the studio told GameSpot that they had a myriad of ideas that they wanted to implement into the game. Besides that, we have no news regarding a setting or even a possible release date. But in 2021, a screenshot appeared online that featured a possible alpha build for the game, which showed a new UI element, a weapon, and a strange glowing tower. Prior to this, there were some leaks that the game will be taking place in a fictional underground city in the Antarctic called Borealis. Not much else was mentioned besides for the fact that the game would connect to all of the previous games in the franchise. Another bit of speculation suggests that the game is going to be an open world game, but that hasn't been officially confirmed either. And that's all I could really find regarding BioShock 4, but it was suggested on Twitter earlier this year that the game finished its pre-production phase and is finally into the production phase of development. But I will try to keep my finger on the pulse if we hear any more information regarding the new entry into the franchise. Now, as for the remake, 2K Games recently suggested that they are working on a remake of one of their older titles. Many fans are led to believe that this could either be BioShock 1 or The Darkness, which is another game that was made by 2K that I personally love. I hope that The Darkness is being considered, but as for BioShock 1, 2K has led people to believe that they might be releasing a remake to drum up support for BioShock 4, and if they did this by putting out a survey asking people what they would want to see, and people filled it out, and it was actually the most voted on the survey. So that's all I could really find regarding that, but just let me know if you'd rather see a remake of BioShock 1 or BioShock 4 down in the comments section. But let's get into should you play in 2024. So if you haven't played this game yet, I always recommend at least giving it a shot. The game is available on literally everything now, so it's possible to play it on everything, but in my opinion, it's honestly a mixed bag for me. BioShock has some amazing parts that are absolutely beautiful, but it also has some parts that are extremely confusing, very buggy. Just for example, BioShock 4, there is this part where you have to travel to this theater and you run into this guy named Sander Cohen. He will then trap you and make you go up against his army of brainwashed bunny people. And then you have to go after his disciples. When you do this, you have to take pictures of them and post them on his wall or his masterpiece in order to be able to escape from this part of Rapture. But Here's the part that's confusing. When you go through this strip mall looking area, you have to find these guys, and if the game somehow glitches and their bodies disappear, you get stuck in this section. And on top of that, if you forget to save, you will have to reload from the very beginning of that point. So if you're already, 3 disciples in and you got to get the last one, and then the last one disappears, you got to do it all over again. And I don't know, and the map itself is very confusing. Even with the quest marker, during this section, the quest marker disappears, and you just have to find them all by going room to room. And it's just super, super confusing. And you run out of ammo very quickly, especially if you're trying to kill the Big Daddy. And the only compliment I can give this section is the crossbow, because this thing saved me so many times throughout the area, and it's pretty much the only saving grace out of the entire game. Next thing I want to talk about is something that I really loved, was the final boss against Atlas, or Fontaine. If you have played this game, it was extremely memorable, and the best way to possibly end the game. And if you've been upgrading your weapons, then you'll be able to do it without any problems, even on the hardest difficulty. It's not a very challenging boss. But that's really it. I highly do recommend checking this game out because it is a lot of fun. And I come back to this game every couple of years and I play it. And I have so much fun when I do it because it's just a nice, mindless shooter. But let's get into my final thoughts. So, even though the game is fairly old, even with the 2016 remaster of the trilogy, it can still be very fun and entertaining to play the game. I personally will always love BioShock 2, just because you get to play as Big Daddy, and it's just so much more entertaining than the first game. I know there's plenty of people out there who might disagree with me on that, but that's just my opinion on it. BioShock features so many different ways to approach each boss fight, and it makes the game extremely entertaining to play, so I highly recommend checking it out. BioShock also wears its political influences on its sleeve, and Rapture is a setting in BioShock that's one of the greatest city concepts for gaming. It's an eerie district, and it's all unique, but tense and claustrophobic at the same time. It's probably the heart of the game's success, and so much of the story is drip-fed to the player through audio diaries, and it just makes the game so compelling. It's just... Which, don't get me wrong, BioShock might not be my favorite out of all the BioShock games, because I like BioShock 2, but I don't hate the game at all. I still really like the original BioShock game. It just wasn't my favorite out of the franchise, but that's all I really have to say about that. I just want to thank everybody for watching. If you enjoyed this, please go watch another video, because that's how the algorithm works. And if you enjoyed this, maybe it'll recommend it to somebody else who likes this kind of content too. We also have Gamescom coming up in a couple of weeks, so don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my coverage of the game reveals of Gamescom 2024. I also have a Dead Rising video that's set to release either tonight or tomorrow that will go over the new footage that was released online for Dead Rising, for the remake. But thanks again for watching, guys, and have a good night.